Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome dear participants to this final module of this week. After having established the directions in which postmodernist criticism has developed, today we are going to discuss poststructuralism and deconstruction. The structure of today's module is like this. We would be introducing this idea of structuralism with Saussures view of language. We would move on to post-structuralism, introducing it and also telling the differences between structuralism and post-structuralism. We would also briefly discuss Derrida's main contribution to the development of the deconstruction idea, and then towards the end we would also discuss a deconstructive reading of Hilda Doolittle's poem Orate. We have seen that how during the postmodernist development the finality of modernist idea was rejected in favor of parallel and multiple truths. It also started a closer reading of the text, and the textual reading is normally open to interpretation. So, what postmodernism had done was to establish the supremacy of the text over a reading of nature or phenomena from the perspective of a social scientist who was trying to fix up certain certainties, the rational arguments, find out what was the truth and the correct answer. Whereas in postmodernity we find that the texts became supreme and therefore they were open to interpretation. Here I quote from Jane Kaplan, who has said that the postmodernist methodology and epistemology is characterized by the relative eclipse of arguments about social science modes of explanation, and it is also commented that there is a shift towards theories from linguistics and literary studies. So, this shift towards linguistics and literary studies is seen in the postmodernist phenomena, as we have been discussing during this week. Postmodernism started to become popular during the 60s. The post-structural approach also is known during that time for its efforts to offer a critical review of normative concepts in classical philosophy. The post-structural approach also based on linguistic theories, and in this approach we find that they try to look at the revaluation of language in terms of studying and understanding theories of knowledge, phenomenology as well as hermeneutics also. The development of the post-structuralist theory is normally referred to a quintet of French theorists, and these are Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Kristeva and Roland Barthes. These philosophers have had a major influence on the readings of structuralist theories and the development of post-structuralist theories in the 80s. It can be said that if structuralism relies upon the logic of language, post-structuralism reveals rhetoric as a subversive, poetic subconsciousness of that logic. The quintet also attempts to unveil and problematize the grand narratives on which the foundation of the modernist society and thought was laid. These philosophers have taken up different avenues for finding out the nature of their own theoretical expansion. For example, Derrida has talked a lot about the philosophy and its development. Foucault has majorly limited to writings in the historical context and power. Lacan has talked about psychoanalysis, whereas Kristeva and Barthes have talked about literary and cultural studies. Barthes' concept of intertextuality and Derrida's concept of difference, which is a conjoined word combining two words, difference and deference. So, these ideas provided the basis for a radical epistemology about how language and abstract concepts do not allow us to ever gain certainty in terms of knowledge. Derrida also suggested that the conventional link between the signifier and signified is at best tenuous only. Normally it is slippery and fragile, and therefore the meaning cannot be considered to be fixed as the structuralist arguments had provided to us. Derrida has also said that the text has a certain meaning within a context. So, this idea of the relation between the text and the context has become very important in the context of understanding Derrida's philosophy. He also says that the complete meaning of a word is present in the speaker's mind such that it can be transmitted without a significant slipping. This idea has been termed as metaphysics by Derrida. Derrida has suggested that the Western thought has been dominated by logocentric claims. These logocentric claims may be derived from different aspects. For example, they may be derived from art or religion or science or political dogma. But they are always presented in a binary, and in the binary a particular pole is always privileged over the other, and therefore it is ascribed a greater value, whereas it also downgrades or excludes the other pole. So, the modernist version of thinking in terms of binary has been challenged by Derrida. He has also discussed how logocentric claims are normally made and justified. He argued that one way users of language attempt to overcome the limitations and circularity of signification is to define concepts not in terms what they are, but through their difference from other things. Structuralism as a theoretical paradigm grew out of a need to systematize the study of literature and literary history. It is also suggested at times that new critical approaches had also laid the foundations for structuralism. As the very name suggests, structuralism is concerned with structures and more particularly with examining the general laws by which they work. It is the belief that individuals unit of any system have meaning only by virtue of their relation to one another. An individual unit does not have any meaning outside these relationships. Like formalism, it has also concentrated entirely on the form and does not consider the actual content of the text. For example, it is not concerned about the cultural interpretation or about the historical significance of a particular text. As long as the structure of relations between the units is preserved, it does not matter which items you select. You can take up a portion from an established piece of literature, or you can also take up a piece from, say, a newspaper report. But the structuralist study would be analytical only, and it would never be evaluative. And therefore, the cultural value of a particular piece of literature or a particular piece of writing has no meaning for the structuralist. They refuse the obvious meaning of the text, something which is very apparent to a lay reader, and seeks instead to isolate certain deep structures within it which are not apparent on the surface. It also does not take the text at the face value, but displaces it into a quite different kind of object. The structuralist ideas were inspired by Sosso's writing. It flourished in the first half of the 20th century as an attempt to apply to literature the methods and insights of the founder of modern structural linguistics, particularly Ferdinand de Saussure. It is an interesting point that among other subjects, Saussure had been an avid scholar of Sanskrit. As a scholar, he had studied Sanskrit as well as other classical language, and in 1880 the thesis which was awarded to him by the Leipzig University was on the use of absolute genitive case in the Rig Veda. So, it is very important aspect for us to understand that the linguistic traditions of Sanskrit learning have also influenced the way modern structuralist ideas have flourished in the world. Most of the classical structuralist notions emerged from Saussure's lectures in Geneva, which he had delivered between 1907 and 1911. These lectures were published posthumously in 1916 under the name of a course in general linguistics. Saussure viewed language as a system of signs which was to be studied synchronically rather than diachronically. He also suggested that each sign has to be seen as being made up of a signifier, a sound image or its graphic equivalent, and a signified, that is the concept or the meaning. He further illustrates it and says that the three independent black marks, which he refers to as C, A and T, are a signifier which evoke the signified cat in the mind of a person who has knowledge of the English language. However, the relation between the signifier and the signified is an arbitrary one. There is no inherent reason except perhaps the cultural and historical convention to understand that these marks should mean cat and should relate to a particular picture in the mind of a language speaker. Therefore, he suggests that the relationship between the sign and the referent, that means the sign and what it refers to, is absolutely arbitrary. Each sign in the system has meaning also only by virtue of its difference from the others. For example, cat has meaning not in itself, but because it is, say, not cap or cat or bat. It does not matter how the signifier alters as long as it preserves its difference from the all other signifiers. And here I quote from Saussure. He says, in the linguistic system, there are only differences. Meaning is not mysteriously immanent in a sign, but is functional, the results of its difference from other signs. It generates automatically a circular process. What is a sign now may be a referent if we take it further, and therefore meaning is not fixed, it cannot be nailed down, but it is scattered and dispersed along the whole chain of signifiers, and it is never fully present in any one sign alone, but is rather a kind of constant flickering of presence and absence together. Howsoever, the structuralists also maintain that there is a definite link between the sign and the referent. Saussure was more concerned with Lang, the objective structure of signs which made their speech possible, and he also believed that the linguistics should not be really too much concerned with parole, what he the name which he used for the actual speech or what people actually said or meant. Still, Saussure's contribution is very important because he discovered the internal structure of the linguistic sign and also differentiated this linguistic sign from its mere acoustic aspects and also from the mental processes with which it was earlier confused. If structuralism divided the sign from the referent, we find that the post-structuralism goes a step further and it divides the signifier from the signified. Post-structuralism is basically a response to the structuralist like Ferdinand de Saussure and also to the writings of Claude Lévi-Strauss in anthropology and also to a certain extent a response to the Russian formalists like Jacobson. Among the most important representatives of post-structuralist philosophy are, as we have already talked about them, Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, Lyotard, Lacan, Foucault, Zizek and his school, and in the USA we find that Judith Butler and Richard Rorty were working in this direction. These post-structuralist philosophers changed the shape of critical inquiry in the areas of philosophy of language, and they also influenced literary theory, gender theories, ethical interpretation as well as neo-pragmatism. Post-structuralists see the theories of the structuralist as based on philosophy of language and anthropology, and they also apply their insights to a wider range of topics and radicalize some of the premises which were put forward by the structuralist. At the same time, we find that there is a lot of difference among the post-structuralists themselves also. They are not exactly duplicating each other's ideas, but some of them move historically or hermeneutically. Some of them may base their ideas on discourse analysis or may also merge critical theory with psychoanalysis. Despite all these differences, we find that at least there are two premises which are common in post-structuralist arguments. First is the understandings about the way language functions and we attach meanings to language. The second is that all of them were influenced by phenomenology, particularly as found in the works of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. The implication of the post-structuralist philosophy convinced the people that language is a much less stable affair than the classical structuralists had initially considered. It is not a well defined or clearly demarcated structure containing symmetrical units of signifiers and signifieds without any doubt, but it is more like a sprawling web where the meaning cannot be fixed. According to the post-structuralist, there is a constant interchange and circulation of elements where none of these elements is absolutely definable and where everything is caught up and traced through by everything else. So, in a way we can say that the introduction of the postmodernist fluidity and flux into the structuralist arguments resulted into a post-structuralist theory. At this point, it is important to discuss Derrida and his basic philosophy. We find that he is not only a major figure associated with post-structuralist argument, but he is also considered to be the founder of deconstruction. In order to understand deconstruction, we also have to understand the exact meaning of the term coined by him, that is difference. As we have already seen, difference is a combination of two different verbs, to defer and to differ. That means there is a quality of differing as well as a quality of difference whenever we refer to the quality of meaning in language. He says that language is only a chain of signifier. It does not consist of the union of signifier and the signified as claimed by the structuralist philosophers. It also means that the concepts which we hold dear to us are not solid and stable meaninged concepts, but these concepts are also fleeting and there is a continual interplay of signifiers. He also says that what we understand to be meaning is really only the mental trace left behind by the play of signifiers. And therefore, he says that there are two important characteristics of language which we have to understand. First, that its play of signifiers continually differs or postpones meaning. This is the first part of this word, difference, and then he also says that the meaning it seems to have is a result of the differences by which we distinguish one signifier from another. This idea by Derrida decentered Western metaphysics and philosophy. Derrida has in a way critiqued the Western philosophy as a logocentric enterprise, which is created by the hierarchies of binary oppositions influencing every aspect of cognition. We have already discussed how binaries give priority to a particular interpretation and also push the second part of the pole, the second binary, into oblivion. But beyond that, Derrida also believes that the Western philosophy has always advocated some ultimate word, presence, essence or truth or reality, which according to it acts as the foundation of all thought, language and experience. It may be the idea of the God, it may be the word spirit, the self, sustenance, matter or whatever other name may be given to it. But that it is considered by the Western philosophy, as Derrida claims, that each of these concepts hopes to found our whole system of thought and language, and therefore, if it is beyond our system of thought and language, then it must also be beyond the linguistic systems. It cannot be implicated in the very languages which it attempts to order and anchor. Somehow it is beyond these language experiments. It has to be somehow anterior to these discourses, which according to Derrida is not a possibility. And therefore, he argues that the web-like complexity of language which is based on infinite linguistic play and difference, reveals that such a search by its very nature is ultimately a futile exercise. The idea of deconstruction, which has arisen from these ideas, is influenced mainly by Derrida, and it also means that the text is not a unified and logical whole. It encourages a close reading of text in order to demonstrate that any given text has irreconcilably opposing and differing meanings. It also breaks the structure from within the structure. However, the common understanding that deconstruction is a dismantling of the structure of a text is not exactly correct. In fact, deconstruction wants to demonstrate that the text is already dismantled itself. Its apparently solid ground is no rock, but thin air, and therefore, the binaries which exist within the text, the other context which exist within the text, ultimately help us to understand that a particular meaning is being continually dismantled and it is being continually deconstructed. So, deconstruction is the name which has been given to the critical operation by which binary oppositions can be partly undermined or by which they can be shown partly to undermine each other in the process of a textual reading. We can say that whereas the structuralist concept was satisfied if it could look at the binary oppositions which were present in a text. For example, the binaries of high and low, light and dark, nature versus culture, etc. So, the structuralist thinkers were satisfied by defining these binary oppositions and exposing the logic of their working. But the idea of deconstruction has gone a step ahead and wants to show that how such oppositions, in order to hold themselves in place, are sometimes betrayed into inverting or collapsing themselves. Derrida, who had coined this idea of deconstruction as well as the term, has argued that the Western culture, which is based on binaries, is ultimately to be challenged, because whenever we look at the boundaries set by the binary opposition, our cognition of things and our thinking also, our knowledge also becomes limited. So, by deconstruction he aims to erase the boundary between binary oppositions and to do so in such a way that the hierarchy which is implied by the oppositions is also thrown into question. So, Derrida's concept of deconstruction has opened up new possibilities of interpretation as well as far as literary texts are concerned. There are certain other statements by Derrida which are sometimes misunderstood. For example, when he says that there is no one meaning, it does not mean that there is no meaning to a particular text. According to Derrida, the context becomes important to understand what meaning has been suggested, but it does not mean that we are freed of responsibility to try as hard as we can to say that the newer meanings may also be possible. He also wants to suggest by this statement that a sentence or a particular quote or a particular text which is attributed to Aristotle or anybody else, for example, would always be open to different interpretations. It does not say anything in a final manner ever, but the newer interpretations are always possible because the binaries can always be questioned. So, in a way, deconstructive criticism shows how texts subvert their own ruling systems of logic. And here we find that a particular example which I am giving over here is given in the context of how the term woman is to be understood and deconstructed. This example I have taken from Terry Eagleton. For example, woman is the opposite, the other of man. She is non-man, defective man, assigned a chiefly negative value in relation to the male first principle. But equally, as Eagleton has written, man is what he is only by virtue of shutting out this other or opposite, defining himself as an antithesis to it, and his whole identity therefore is caught up and put at risk in the very gesture by which he seeks to assert his unique existence, his autonomous existence. At the same time, we would have to understand that in this game plan, woman is not just an other in the sense of something beyond his ken, but an other intimately related to him as the image of what he is not, and therefore as an essential reminder of what he is. So, as a post-structuralist theory, deconstruction sees all writing is a complex historical cultural process which is rooted in the relations of text to each other as well as in the institutions and conventions of writing. It has also suggested that human knowledge is neither as controllable nor as convincing as Western thought has always suggested it to be. And it also suggests that language operates in a very subtle manner. It can also be acting in a very contradictory manner, and therefore, the certainty of meaning would always elude us, and the text would always be open to different and newer interpretations. This post-structuralism is a style of thought which embraces the deconstructive operations of Derrida, the work of the French historian Michel Foucault, the writings of the French psychoanalyst James Lacan, and the feminist philosopher and critic Julia Kristeva. When we have to deconstruct a text, we have to look at certain aspects. As we have discussed earlier, deconstruction is not denial of a meaning, but let us say it has to see how the binaries are placed so that the text is open to different interpretations, and within the text these binaries are acting against each other. So, when we have to deconstruct a text, we have to begin from a position of skepticism. Instead of searching for an authorial intention or for a cultural interpretation as it was routinely done, we have to begin with a sense of skepticism and also look at this possibility of finding multiplicity of meanings. One should not be guided by the common logic or the most significant interpretation or the interpretation which has always been accepted by people to be there, but we have to be open to the possibility of multiplicity of meanings. At the same time, while we are aware that multiple meanings are there, we are not to privilege one particular meaning over the other. We have to identify the biases which may be there, for example, the cultural biases, the political biases, or at the same time the hierarchical oppositions which are at work in the given text. Deconstruction also involves questioning the logic of binary oppositions. At the same time, we have to look at the sentence structure to find out in which ways the text has betrayed its own logic. We have to look for the gaps, the aporias which may be there. We have to analyze the tone, the sentence structure and stylistics in combination with each other to find out how within the text the logic is being betrayed and challenged. So, in a way, a deconstructive reading would involve playing with the possible meanings and looking for alternate interpretations. We also have to remember that deconstruction is not about destroying meaning. It is about accepting that meaning is a function of both difference and difference. So, one has to adopt a reading strategy that treats meaning as contingent and fluid, and one also has to avoid the fallacy of looking for transcendental signifier and signified. So, in a way the text becomes a web of signifiers which is open to immense possibilities of interpretations, and in which no particular interpretation has to be given more significance in comparison to the other. In the next two slides, I have given a deconstructive reading of Hilda Doolittle's poem Oread. Hilda Doolittle's poem is a very popular example, and you would find it quoted in different places in different sources also. So, this is a poem which is often understood as one which has already deconstructed itself. The title itself contains and creates a certain expectation as far as the reader are concerned, but the poem immediately thwarts this expectation. As far as the meaning is concerned, we find that the meanings can also become problematic. We do not understand whether the language of the poem revels in precarity, violence and destructive power of nature. So, these aspects become important because the reader does not become clear whether the poem wants to invoke the sea or the forest. In the detailing of these slides, you would find how the meaning has been deconstructed as a part of the poem. So, this particular illustration is helpful whenever we have to look at a particular passage from any literary text to find out the possible ways in which the deconstruction of meaning can be traced. So, in this week we have covered different aspects related with postmodernist philosophy. In the next week, we would begin with the discussions of feminism and gender theories with you. Thank you.